She heard it through a half-open door, 3 minutes before she became his wife. The corridor outside the Hartwell drawing room was narrow and cool, the plaster walls carrying the particular chill of a house where the fires had been allowed to go out slowly over many months. Josephine had paused there not from any deliberate intention, but because her borrowed gloves were too tight at the knuckles, and she had stopped to press them flat against her fingers, working the kid leather into submission with the careful attention one gives to small, manageable problems when larger ones press too close. The ceremony was to begin at 10. The solicitor, Mr. Aldous Crane, had arrived at 9:30 with his leather satchel and his expression of practiced neutrality, and the sound of his measured voice carrying through that half-open door was what stopped her hand at the glove. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Worley, said, "She is convenient, nothing more. I require a woman of reasonable address to manage Worley and to be present for the boy. I did not require anything else, and I have not sought anything else. The arrangement is clear." The silence that followed was Mr. Crane's silence, a professional quiet, neither approving nor disapproving, the silence of a man paid to record facts and not to feel them. Josephine did not move for the length of 3 slow heartbeats. Then she pressed the glove flat one final time, straightened her back, and walked toward the door. She had known the arrangement was convenient. She had told herself so every morning for the 2 weeks since the offer had been made. She had not required it said aloud in that particular register, with that particular finality, 3 minutes before the ceremony. She had not required it. She filed it away in the same quiet interior space where she had filed her father's last letter and the solicitor's accounting of the £4,000 of debt and every season she had not had and every introduction that had not come. She was very good at filing. She had been practicing for years. Her father, Sir Gerald Hartwell of Ashton Cross, had been a man of charm and moderate expectations who had managed to spend considerably beyond both. When the fever took him in February, what remained was a farmhouse with a leaking roof, 2 servants who had not been paid in 4 months, and a debt of £4,000 held against the estate by a firm in Cheapside, whose patience, the solicitor had gently indicated, was of the limited kind. Josephine was 4 months past her 23rd birthday. She had no season behind her, no presentation, no connections of the sort that produce offers. What she had was a face her mother had called handsome in good light, a habit of reading that the neighborhood considered mildly eccentric, and the absolute absence of anyone who might be expected to help. The offer came through Mr. Crane, which told her it was business before it told her anything else. The Duke of Worley required a wife of respectable birth, modest but verifiable, who would take up residence at Worley Hall, 40 miles north of London, and fulfill the domestic and social duties of a duchess without complication or expectation. The settlement was £600 per annum, secured against the Worley estate, and it would be paid whether the marriage produced anything beyond its stated terms or not. Her father's debts would be retired. The farmhouse would be settled on her outright. She had asked Mr. Crane for 24 hours to consider it. She had spent those 24 hours sitting in her father's empty study, looking at the leaking roof and the 2 unpaid servants and the letter from the firm in Cheapside. And she had said yes. The church at Ashton Cross was small and smelled of cold stone and old candles. Edmund Ashford stood at the altar in a coat of deep blue and an expression that suggested the coat was the warmer of the 2. He was tall, with the particular stillness of a man who had decided long ago that stillness was the safest posture. His jaw was firm and his eyes were gray, and they moved over her face once, briefly, with something that might have been assessment, or might have been the automatic registration of an object that had entered his line of sight. He did not smile. Neither did she. They spoke their vows in the measured voices of two people completing a transaction they had agreed was reasonable. And when it was done, Mr. Crane's pen made its final mark, and the thing was accomplished. Josephine was the Duchess of Worley. The gloves remained too tight at the knuckles. Worley Hall presented itself at the end of a long gravel drive on a gray afternoon 10 days after the wedding, the pair having spent those days at a small house in Grosvenor Street that Edmund occupied during the season, exchanging meals and a handful of carefully correct sentences each day before he retreated to his study, and she retreated to the small sitting room assigned for her use. She had not unpacked at Grosvenor Street. There had seemed no point in arranging something temporary. The hall itself was large and handsome and had the look of a house that had been grand for a very long time and had recently stopped being tended with quite the care it deserved. The east wing's upper shutters were latched. The kitchen garden had gone straggly. The gravel was neat enough, but the topiary along the front walk had grown past its intended shapes into something more expressive and less controlled. Josephine took note of all of this through the carriage window as they came up the drive, filing each observation away with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything. And when the door opened and she stepped down into the still November air, she stood for a moment looking up at the facade and told herself that a house could be learned. A house was a manageable problem. Edmund's mother, Lady Meredith Ashford, was waiting in the entrance hall. She was a woman in her late 50s whose posture suggested she had never in her adult life leaned against anything for support. Her gown was dark lavender, her jewelry was substantial, and her examination of Josephine took no more than 3 seconds and concluded, the set of her mouth made clear, in a verdict that would require considerable evidence to revise. Beside her stood Miss Cecily Vane, whose family, Josephine would learn within the week, had been sitting at Meredith's elbow for approximately 2 seasons, waiting for Edmund to notice what the dowager considered an obvious and appropriate match. Cecily was 20 years old, polished to a quiet gleam, and she looked at Josephine with an expression of perfect composed neutrality that was, if one paid attention to the specific quality of its blankness, worse than open hostility. "My son's new arrangement," Meredith said, placing the word arrangement with the care of a woman setting down a piece of sharp china. Josephine inclined her head. "Lady Meredith, it is a pleasure to make your acquaintance." The response was technically civil. Meredith's answering smile was also technically civil. They understood each other precisely. Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs. He was 9 years old and slight for his age, with serious dark eyes and hair that wanted cutting. Edmund's ward, orphaned at 6, when his father, Edmund's younger cousin, had died of a fever in the West Indies. Thomas had been at Worley for 3 years, and had the particular expression of a child who has learned that the adults around him have a great many concerns more pressing than his own. He looked at Josephine from the top of the stairs, with an assessment that was, in its way, more careful and more honest than anyone else's in the entrance hall. And then he turned and went back down the corridor without a word. Edmund said, "You will want to rest after the journey," and moved toward his study. The house arranged itself around Josephine over the following days, its corridors and cold rooms, its kitchen staff who were competent and wary, its housekeeper, Mrs. Pell, who was kind in the measured way of a woman who had learned not to invest her kindness where it might not be wanted or might not last. Josephine went through the household accounts with Mrs. Pell on the 3rd morning, sitting at the table in the housekeeper's room with the ledgers between them, and she asked careful practical questions about the kitchen garden and the east wing shutters and the tradesmen's outstanding bills, and Mrs. Pell answered each one with a relief she tried, not entirely successfully, to conceal. It had been some time since anyone had asked. The east wing held the piano. She found it on the 5th day, drawn by the particular quality of silence in that corridor, the way the air sat differently there, denser and more still. The drawing room at the end was covered in Holland cloth, the furniture shapes like sleeping animals in the gray light, and in the corner stood an upright piano with its lid down and a faint bloom of dust along the case. She did not touch it. Something about its position, slightly off-center, angled away from the window where it might have caught the light, told her it had been moved there deliberately, turned away from something. She asked Mrs. Pell about it quietly, 2 days later, framing the question as one of domestic management. Mrs. Pell considered her hands for a moment. The late Duchess was fond of music. His Grace has not permitted the instrument to be used since her passing. I see, said Josephine, and she did see, and she did not ask again. Edmund Ashford had been married before. The first Duchess of Worley, Eleanor, had died 18 months ago on the road from Bath. When the carriage Edmund had ordered prepared for an early departure, had met ice on the hill at Lambourne and come off the road. She had been 27 years old. The coroner's finding had been misadventure. Edmund had returned to London, closed the Worley accounts for the season, and conducted himself with the kind of control that those who did not know him called composure, and those who did know him called something closer to self-imposed penance. Josephine did not know this in its full particulars when she arrived. She assembled it from the things that were present and the things that were absent. From the way Edmund moved through the hall, as though careful not to displace anything. From the portrait in the upper corridor that faced the wall, its gilt frame visible, but its face turned inward, as though it had been repositioned not in anger, but in the specific discipline of a man who has decided that looking at something is a luxury he does not deserve. She understood, from all of this, that she had married a man who was not cold so much as he was controlled, and that the control had a shape the grief had carved, and that grief of that particular architecture was not something she had any right to disturb. She was, after all, convenient. Nothing more. If you find yourself moved by Josephine's story so far, a kind word in the comments keeps this channel going. Now back to Worley, where something is about to shift. It was Thomas who shifted it. Not by design, because Thomas had no designs, only a child's perfectly calibrated instinct for what is genuine and what is performed. He began appearing in doorways when Josephine was in a room. Not entering, not speaking, simply existing in her peripheral awareness with the patient quality of a small creature, deciding whether a new element of its environment was safe. She gave him books from the library without ceremony, setting them on the table in the schoolroom with no instruction and no expectation. She found them returned within a day or two to a position slightly different from where she had left them, which told her they had been read. She began leaving different ones. The incident with the Dowager took place 3 weeks into Josephine's residence at Worley Hall, on a morning when Meredith had remained after breakfast with the clear intention of conducting what she would have called a frank conversation about the season's social requirements and what it actually was, which was a detailed assessment of Josephine's inadequacies, delivered in the vocabulary of helpful advice. Cecily was present as witness and anchor, seated with her embroidery in the posture of someone who had attended this kind of performance before and knew her role in it. "A woman of your background," Meredith said, the word background doing precise and considerable work, "will find the expectations of a duchess rather more than she has been prepared for." I say this in the spirit of assistance. Edmund's first marriage was notable for the grace with which the late Duchess met every social demand. She was bred to it, of course. One cannot simply acquire that quality. Josephine had been listening to this and its variations for 3 weeks. She said, "Of course," in the tone she had been using for 3 weeks, which was even and uninflected and gave Meredith very little to grip. Meredith turned to the window. "The boy has been growing quite attached to you, I am told." Something shifted in Josephine's chest, very quietly. "I have been spending time with him," Yes. It would be unkind, Meredith said, still at the window, her voice acquiring the gentle precision of someone administering a necessary correction. To encourage an attachment that the circumstances of this arrangement cannot sustain. When Edmund marries properly, the boy's situation will be determined by the wife Edmund actually chooses for the position. It would be a cruelty to allow Thomas to believe this present situation is permanent. Thomas was in the doorway. He had come in from the garden and had not yet been noticed, and he stood with his coat still buttoned and his mud-marked boots just inside the threshold, and his face was doing something very careful and very still, the face of a child absorbing a verdict he has heard delivered in some form before. Josephine set down her teacup. "Thomas," she said in her ordinary voice, the one she used when she was asking him to pass a book or asking what he thought of a chapter's ending. "Would you ask Mrs. Pell whether the library fire has been lit? I should like to work in there this afternoon." Thomas looked at her. Something in his expression shifted by a fraction, enough to tell her he understood what she had done. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went. Josephine turned back to Lady Meredith, with a stillness in her own posture that was, for the first time, not entirely the result of self-discipline. "I should be cautious," she said carefully, "about how much confidence any arrangement places in its own permanence. Circumstances have a way of refusing to hold still." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She did not know until Mrs. Pell mentioned it the following morning in passing that Edmund had been in the corridor outside the drawing room for the latter portion of that exchange. She had no way to know how long he had stood there, or what portion he had heard, or what his expression had carried in the gray corridor light. She filed this information away with the rest and did not examine it, because examining it required allowing herself to believe it meant something, and she had been wrong before about what things meant. 3 minutes before a wedding in a narrow, cold corridor where her gloves were too tight. Edmund's behavior toward her changed after that morning, though he would have denied the change, and it was the kind of change designed to be deniable. He began appearing in rooms she occupied, not addressing her directly, working at the desk in the library while she read, or standing at the window of the morning room with a cup of tea that he did not appear to be drinking. He asked about the household accounts one evening after dinner, not because he needed the information, but, she understood, because he wanted a reason to remain at the table. He asked what she thought of the East Gardens plan, and then listened to her answer with an attention that slightly exceeded the question's weight. He did not touch her. He did not say anything that could not be repeated in company. But his body was in her rooms, and it was there by a choice she had not missed. And she was choosing carefully, not to trust the choice. She had been convenient. She had been told so. The season's first ball was hosted by Lord and Lady Fenwick on the 14th of December, in a house in Mayfair whose ballroom could accommodate 200 and whose reputation for social precision was such that an invitation functioned as a verdict and a snub functioned as a sentence. Edmund had gone ahead that morning on estate business, and Josephine arrived in the Worley carriage, attended only by Mrs. Pell's niece, a quiet girl named Agnes, who had been lent for the evening and who meant well. Meredith and Cecily had gone earlier. Josephine understood, from this arrangement, that she was expected to arrive alone and find her own position in the room, which was itself an indication of the position she was expected to occupy. She wore her best gown, which was ivory silk retrimmed twice, and she knew it against the room's jeweled abundance the way one knows a plain-spoken sentence against a great deal of elaborate decoration. She was not unaware of how she appeared. She simply had no remedy for it, and she was not in the habit of apologizing for what she could not remedy. Edmund was across the room when she entered, in conversation with 2 older men, whose posture suggested they were accustomed to being attended to. He saw her arrive. She was certain of it. He did not move. Meredith was waiting with Cecily at the edge of the dancing floor, and when Josephine approached to pay her respects, Meredith's expression carried the specific quality of composure that covers a settled intention. "Miss Hartwell," Meredith said distinctly, in the carrying voice that well-placed women learn early and use strategically. Two conversations nearby went briefly still. "You found the room. How resourceful." "I was uncertain whether Edmund had thought to arrange an escort for his little convenience." The word landed in the space it was designed to land in. Josephine was aware, without looking, that the two nearby conversations had not resumed. She was aware of Cecily's carefully placed stillness. She was aware of a woman in green silk at Meredith's shoulder, whom she did not know, and who was listening. "Lady Meredith," Josephine said evenly, "the room is very fine." She did not look for Edmund. She would not give the room that. The evening was long. She danced twice, with men whose names she had been told, and promptly found herself forgetting, and she stood with a glass of champagne she did not drink at the edge of the room for a time, during which she was aware, with the clarity of someone who has learned to observe without appearing to observe, that Meredith was circulating. She was moving through the room with the practiced ease of a woman on a social errand, stopping at intervals to speak in lowered voices, and Josephine could read, from the angle of heads and the subsequent quality of glances in her direction, the nature of what was being said. Edmund remained at a distance. He spoke with the men, with Lord Fenwick, with a group of younger women who laughed at something he said in a way that indicated he had attempted, for once, to be charming. He did not come near her. At 10:15, Meredith gathered her in the center of a small group that included the woman in green silk, a Lord Somebody whose name Josephine had not caught, and Cecily, and she said, with her champagne glass held at a precise height that communicated both confidence and ease, "We were just saying how resourceful Edmund was to find a practical solution to the boy's situation and the estate's domestic needs. A convenience and nothing more, really, when one considers it plainly. I do hope Miss Hartwell understands the arrangement is not intended to be anything it cannot be." 30 people were within hearing. Not all of them were attending, but enough of them were. Edmund was 20 feet away. He heard it. She was certain he heard it, because she saw the particular quality of stillness that moved over him, the exact stillness of a man who has decided not to move. He did not turn. He did not cross the room. Josephine stood inside that silence and felt the floor of something she had been trying not to build give way beneath her, quickly. And then she was standing on what remained, which was the same floor she had been standing on before she came to Worley, and she was familiar enough with it to keep her balance. She set her champagne down on a passing tray. She said, to no one in particular, "If you will excuse me," and she went to find Agnes and her coat. She did not leave. She stayed another hour, because leaving would have given the room something it did not deserve. She stood by the windows and spoke, when spoken to, with perfect equanimity, and she looked at the snowfall beginning in the garden below, light and fine against the black glass. And she thought about the 40 miles between London and Worley Hall, and the £600 per annum that were hers regardless, and the house that would be manageable if she continued to manage it, and she made the decision she had been circling for 3 weeks, without allowing herself to complete the circle. She would tell him what she had heard. Not to wound him, not to demand anything from him, but because the pretense had a shape she had been bending herself to accommodate, and she was tired of the accommodation, and he deserved to know that she had known from the beginning what she was, and that she had come anyway, and that she intended to remain. and that she was asking nothing of him except the honesty of knowing what they actually were to each other, without the additional weight of a kindness she could not quite parse. She sought him out the following afternoon, in his study, where he was standing at the window with a letter he had apparently not read, given how long he had been holding it. She knocked. He turned. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, before the shape of the room could suggest she needed permission to speak. "On the morning of our wedding, I was in the corridor outside the drawing room before the ceremony. I heard what you said to Mr. Crane." Edmund was very still. The quality of his stillness was different from its usual form. The usual form was controlled. This was arrested. "Convenient," she said, without heat, without trembling, which cost her something she elected not to show. "Nothing more. I know that is what you intended. I have known it since before I said my vows, and I came anyway. And I have stayed, and I do not say this to ask you to feel something that is not present. I say it because last night, Lady Meredith used those words in front of 30 people, and you heard her, and you did not speak. And I understood from that what is and is not possible. I am not asking you to change what is possible. I am simply telling you that I know what I am, and I am at peace with it, and you need not perform a kindness that does not exist." She had practiced none of this. It was not better for the lack of practice. Edmund put the letter down. He looked at her across the width of his desk with an expression she did not know how to read, because it was not the expression she was accustomed to seeing on his face, which was the controlled expression, the managed surface. This one had something beneath it that the surface was no longer entirely covering. He said, "The carriage." She waited. "Eleanor," he said. "My first wife. She died in the carriage I ordered prepared for an early departure from Bath, the ice on the hill at Lambourne. I chose the morning. I insisted on the early hour. I was impatient to return to London, and I did not wait for the road reports." He paused. "I have not permitted myself to want another person's presence since. To want someone's presence and to be the reason they are absent from it are not separable things, as it turns out." The room held this. Josephine said very quietly, "The piano in the east wing." She played it. His jaw moved. I could not hear it. She did not say she was sorry. She did not say it would be different now. She said, "I know what it is to file things away in places you do not go back to." And Edmund looked at her with the expression of a man who has been understood by someone he had not given permission to understand him, and found, against all his careful architecture, that he did not want to revoke the permission. She left him there. She went back to the small sitting room she had made her own over the weeks, with its window onto the kitchen garden and the 3 books she had borrowed from the library and had not yet returned, and she sat down and was very quiet for a long time, because something in her chest was doing something she had not planned for and was not ready to name. The Fenwick ball had a second evening, which Josephine had not been aware of when she had formed her decision to endure the first. The following Friday, the same company reassembled, and Meredith sent a note requesting that Josephine attend, a note whose phrasing managed to make a request carry the force of a summons. Josephine suspected this was intentional. She suspected the room would be arranged for something, and she went because she was not in the habit of retreating from arrangements. She wore the ivory silk again. She had no other option of consequence. She arrived in the Worley carriage and was shown into the ballroom where the same company occupied much the same positions as before, and Meredith was at the center of the room with Cecily and the woman in green silk, whose name Josephine had by now been told was Mrs. Aldgate, and who had taken it upon herself to serve as a kind of auxiliary commentary to the proceedings. Edmund was not present when she arrived. Meredith crossed to her with the ease of a woman conducting a movement she has rehearsed. "Miss Hartwell," she said, and the room's noise adjusted by a degree. I have been hoping to speak with you plainly. There are certain expectations of the role you are currently occupying that I am not certain you have fully absorbed. Edmund's first marriage established a standard for this family's social standing. What you represent is a practical measure, and practical measures require their own kind of clarity. I think it would be best for everyone, including you, if we established certain boundaries of conduct going forward. Josephine stood with her hands at her sides, her gloves still too tight, and the familiar quiet interior space was available to her if she needed it, and she thought she would not need it. And she was prepared to stand in this particular room for however long was required. The double doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. Edmund Ashford, Duke of Worley, crossed the room in 3 strides that were not hurried and were not slow, the kind of strides that have a direction and a purpose and produce a quality of attention in whatever room contains them. The music did not stop, but the conversations nearest his path did, one by one, in a small widening quiet that moved ahead of him across the floor. He came to Josephine. He took her hand, which was the first time he had taken her hand outside the ceremony, and he turned so that they were facing the room together, and he said, in the carrying voice of a man who has decided the room will hear him, "My wife." 2 words, no elaboration, his hand over hers, steady and present. Meredith's composure did not break. It underwent a very controlled, very visible rearrangement, the expression of a woman who has placed considerable confidence in a fixed structure and is watching that structure decline to cooperate. Cecily's embroidery was not present at this particular gathering, and the absence of the prop left her expression slightly more legible than usual, something that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but was somewhere between the two. Mrs. Aldgate said nothing, which was, Josephine suspected, unusual for her. Mr. Crane appeared at the edge of the gathering a moment later, as though he had been somewhere in the vicinity of the hallway in a professional capacity. He nodded at Edmund with the neutral expression of a man confirming what he had come to confirm. The settlement had been signed and executed before the ceremony by a solicitor and was irrevocable under the terms established at the time of the marriage. It had always been irrevocable. The question had apparently been raised somewhere in the preceding days in a manner that had required Mr. Crane's presence to resolve. He inclined his head at Josephine with the specific warmth of a man who permits himself, on occasion, to be pleased by the outcomes he helps produce, and then he took himself back to the hallway. The room went on around them. The music resumed. Someone near the windows resumed a conversation that had been paused. Meredith said, "Edmund?" with a precision that had lost some of its confidence, and Edmund said, "Yes, Mother," with a courtesy that was complete and entirely closed, and the quality of that closure was, for anyone attending to it, its own kind of declaration. He led Josephine onto the floor for the next dance, which was a simple country reel, and she danced it, because not dancing it would have required an explanation she did not need to provide. His hand in hers across the figure of the dance was warm and present and not performative, and she knew the difference, having had occasion to observe both. They drove back to Worley in the dark. The snow that had begun last Friday had not entirely resolved, and there were traces of it at the edges of the road in the carriage lamp's light. Edmund sat across from her and looked out at the road for a time, and then he said, without looking at her, "I have been told that I am difficult to be with." "Yes," Josephine said. "I should not like to continue being difficult to be with." She looked at his profile against the dark glass, the firm jaw and the gray eyes, and the stillness that was still present, but differently constituted than it had been, as though it had shifted slightly on its foundations to make room for something. "That is within your authority to change," she said. He looked at her then. "Yes," he said. "I am beginning to think so." The 40 miles passed without either of them needing to speak again, and the silence was not the careful silence of two people managing their distance, but the quieter silence of two people who have said enough and know it. Worley Hall received them at midnight, the windows lit against the dark, Mrs. Pell having arranged for fires and for supper on the sideboard in case it was wanted. Thomas had been permitted, in honor of some small reason or another that Mrs. Pell had declined to specify, to remain awake until their return, and he was sitting on the third stair of the entrance hall staircase when they came in his dressing gown and his serious dark eyes, with the expression of a child who is working very hard at appearing casual about something he cares about considerably. Edmund looked at him for a moment. Then he said, in a tone Josephine had not heard from him before, which was quiet and without the careful management, "You should be in bed." "I know," Thomas said. There was a pause. "Go to bed," Edmund said. Thomas looked at Josephine. She held his gaze and gave him the very small, very private nod that cost her nothing and that he had needed, and he looked at it with the precise solemnity of a child receiving something he has been waiting for, without allowing himself to say so. "Good night," he said. He went up the stairs. Edmund watched him go. Something moved across his face in the candlelight, which Josephine observed and did not remark upon, because some things are not made better by being remarked upon. She went to take off her coat, and after a moment she heard his footsteps on the corridor floor, moving in the direction of the east wing. She did not follow. She sat with her supper and her tea and the kitchen garden window showing her its dark winter rectangle, and she listened to the hall's particular silence, which was a different silence now than it had been when she arrived, weighted differently, less like the silence of absence, and more like the silence of a space being reconsidered. When she passed the East Wing corridor on her way upstairs an hour later, the door at the end stood open. The Holland cloth had been pulled from the piano. The lid was up. In the morning, she found the portrait. It was still on the wall of the upper corridor where it had always been, but it had been turned to face outward. The late Duchess of Worley, Eleanor, looked out from the gilt frame with the composed expression of a well-made portrait. A young woman with light eyes and a composed mouth, and the particular look of someone who had been painted at a moment when she was doing her best to be what was required of her. Josephine looked at her for a moment, in the gray morning light, with something that was not quite sorrow and was not quite kinship, but lived somewhere between the two. She thought, a man who turns a portrait to face the room again has decided that he can afford to look. Christmas came to Worley Hall with the first real snowfall of the year, heavy and settling, the kind that changes a house's sound, muffling the gravel and softening the edges of the kitchen garden and making the whole estate feel both smaller and more present to itself. Mrs. Pell brought greenery for the mantels. Agnes came back from London with Cecily's name no longer attached to any conversation she carried in with her, which told Josephine that certain things had been resolved in the drawing rooms she was not present for. Mr. Crane sent a brief formal note confirming the settlement's final accounting, the £600 per annum arranged and irrevocably secured, which she read and folded and placed in the small box on her dressing table, where she kept her father's last letter and the keys to the Ashton Cross farmhouse. Edmund had a meeting with Mr. Crane in the library on the 20th, and when it was done, he sought her out in the morning room where she was working on the accounts, and he said, without preamble, "The Ashton Cross roof has been repaired. The 2 remaining servants have been paid their arrears. The farmhouse is yours, clear of all encumbrance." Josephine put her pen down. "The £4,000, she said. "Retired," He paused. "I should have attended to it sooner." She looked at him across the desk, at the man who had told a solicitor she was convenient, and had then spent 3 months demonstrating, in every movement he made through a house he had stopped inhabiting, that he did not entirely mean it. "You have attended to it now," she said. He stayed. They went over the accounts together. On the 24th of December, the snowfall reached the depth that turns a window into a different kind of thing, and Thomas played the piano in the east wing. He had been asking, obliquely, in the way of a child who has learned to ask sideways rather than directly, for a week. Josephine had said nothing to Edmund because it was not hers to say. Edmund had said nothing at all, which she had been prepared to accept. And then, on the 24th, in the morning, Edmund had gone to the east wing himself, and the sound of the lid going up reached the morning room where she and Thomas were reading. And Thomas had looked up from his book with the particular stillness of a child who does not want to move in case moving makes the thing disappear. "Go on," she said. He went. The music was hesitant at first, the careful notes of a child working out a melody he had been storing up without a place to put it. And then it steadied, and found its shape, and moved through the hall in the way music does when the rooms around it are prepared to receive it. It was not a complicated piece. It was a simple air, worked out by ear and not by instruction, the kind of music that has no ambition beyond being itself. Edmund stood at the door of the East Wing drawing room and listened. Josephine came to stand beside him in the corridor, not touching, close enough to be present without requiring anything. And the music came through the open door, and the snow came down outside the window at the corridor's end, and the portrait of Eleanor looked out from the upper hall into whatever it was the house had become. After a time, Edmund's hand found hers, not performed, not announced, simply present, the way warmth is present when the fire has been properly laid, the way a room is different when someone is in it who belongs there. Josephine looked at his hand, and then she looked at the corridor and the falling snow, and she thought of the narrow, cold passage where her gloves had been too tight, and the 3 slow heartbeats she had stood still inside those words before she had continued walking toward the door. And she thought, that distance was real, and this distance is real, and what is between them is everything a woman can make from 4,000 pounds of debt, and a marriage in a cold church and 40 miles north, and the particular courage of continuing to be herself in a house that had not known what to do with her. She was at Worley Hall. She was precisely where she had chosen to be. Thomas played the simple air through to its end, and when it finished, the last note held for a moment in the cold room before the snow outside took the silence back again, and in the corridor, Edmund's hand remained in hers, and the house was quiet in the way that a house is quiet when it has stopped being empty. If Josephine's story stayed with you, leave a thought in the comments. This channel lives on the stories you take the time to share, and there are more waiting, just like this one.